The silence stretched like a noose around Main Street. Every eye in Salvation Creek bore into Jack Morrison as he straightened from the woman's hand, his lips still warm from the kiss that had just damned them both. The crowd hadn't moved, not the preacher clutching his Bible, not the shopkeeper's wife with her hand pressed to her throat, not even the children who'd been playing in the dust moments before. Rebecca Thorne stood frozen beside the general store steps, her pale fingers still extended where Jack had lifted them to his mouth. The black shawl around her shoulders seemed to drink in the afternoon light, making her appear more ghost than woman. But Jack had felt the tremor in her hand, the proof of life the town refused to see. "You fool," someone whispered from the crowd. "You goddamn fool." Jack's spurs chimed as he turned to face them all, his hat casting shadows over eyes that had seen enough death to stop fearing superstition. He'd ridden into Salvation Creek 3 days ago, dusty and broke, looking for work and a hot meal. Instead, he'd found a town paralyzed by fear of a woman who'd never hurt a soul. The stories had started the moment he'd asked about her. Rebecca Thorne, they said, whose husband had died in a mining accident 6 months after their wedding, whose second husband had been thrown from his horse and broken his neck, whose third had simply vanished one winter night, leaving only bloody footprints in the snow that led nowhere. 3 dead men in 5 years. The devil's bride, they called her, death's daughter, the cursed woman of Salvation Creek. But Jack had watched her from his room at the boarding house, seen her tend the wild flowers behind the church when she thought no one was looking, witnessed her leave baskets of bread on the doorsteps of families too proud to ask for help, but too hungry to refuse. Whatever darkness followed Rebecca Thorne, it wasn't of her making. The crowd began to shift, murmurs rising like distant thunder. Preacher Williams stepped forward, his face carved from righteous stone. "Son," he said, his voice carrying the weight of biblical judgment, "you don't know what you've done." Jack's hand drifted to his gun belt, not in threat but in habit. The woman beside him had gone statue still, waiting for the storm she'd weathered too many times before. That's when the hoofbeats started, distant but approaching fast, carrying news that would change everything. Asterisk, asterisk. The rider materialized through the heat shimmer like a harbinger, his horse lathered with sweat and foam. Sheriff Coleman pulled his mount to a skidding halt in front of the crowd, dust billowing around the gathered townsfolk. His face was grim as weathered leather, and his eyes found Jack immediately. "Morrison," he called out, dismounting with the heavy movements of a man carrying bad news. "We need to talk." Jack felt the weight of every stare, the collective held breath of Salvation Creek. Rebecca's hand had withdrawn to her side, but she hadn't stepped away from him. That small act of defiance sent whispers rippling through the crowd like wind through dry grass. "Talk here," Jack said, his voice steady. "Got nothing to hide." Coleman's jaw worked like he was chewing on words too bitter to swallow. "Got word from the territorial marshal. That business up in Copper Falls, they're saying it was murder, not accident. Saying whoever did it might be heading this way." The preacher's wife let out a small cry. "It's her," she breathed, pointing a trembling finger at Rebecca. "Death follows her wherever she goes. Now it's coming for all of us." Jack felt the moment crystallizing around him like winter air. He could walk away, mount his horse, ride out of Salvation Creek, and leave Rebecca to face whatever storm was brewing. The smart play, the safe play, the kind of choice that had kept him alive through 10 years of drifting from town to town. But Rebecca's eyes found his then, and in them he saw something that cut deeper than fear. Resignation, the terrible acceptance of a woman who'd learned not to expect anyone to stand beside her when the world turned dark. "Jack," Sheriff Coleman's voice carried warning, "you don't know the whole story here. The things that happened to her husbands were accidents," Jack interrupted, surprising himself with the steel in his voice, "or coincidence, or just the kind of bad luck that follows some folks like a shadow." The crowd shifted, uncomfortable murmurs growing louder. Someone spat in the dust. A shop door slammed shut. Mrs. Henley stepped forward, her face twisted with righteous anger. "My husband was going to propose to her once. Day before he changed his mind, He fell into the mill wheel, nearly died. You want that kind of luck, stranger? The sheriff's hand moved to his gun belt, not threatening, but ready. There's more riders coming, Jack. Federal men asking questions about Rebecca's past, about things that happened before she came here. In the distance, dust clouds were already rising on the horizon. How long? Jack asked, scanning the horizon where dust clouds grew larger with each passing minute. Hour, maybe less. Coleman wiped sweat from his brow. Jack, they're carrying federal warrants. This isn't some territorial dispute. The crowd began to fracture, some folks hurrying toward their homes, while others pressed closer, drawn by the terrible magnetism of impending violence. Rebecca finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper but cutting through the murmur like a blade. I never told them my real name. Jack turned to her, seeing something new in her expression, not fear, but a kind of weary determination. What's your real name? Rebecca Dalton. The words fell like stones into still water. My father was Marcus Dalton. The sheriff's face went white. Mrs. Henley gasped and crossed herself. Even Jack felt his blood cool. Marcus Dalton, the railroad baron who disappeared 5 years ago with $2 million in government bonds, leaving behind a trail of murdered investors and burned-out homesteads across 3 territories. Jesus Christ, Coleman breathed. You're his daughter. I had nothing to do with what he did, Rebecca said, but her voice carried the hollow ring of words spoken too many times to deaf ears. I changed my name, tried to disappear, but somehow they always find me. The hoofbeats were closer now, accompanied by the jangle of spurs and gun leather. 6 riders, Jack counted, their badges glinting in the afternoon sun. Federal marshals, moving with the methodical purpose of men who'd tracked their quarry across 1,000 miles. Preacher Williams raised his Bible like a shield. The sins of the father, he intoned. She's brought a curse on this whole town. Jack's hand found his Colt's grip. 6 federal men against 1 drifter with a half-empty gun belt, and a reputation built more on stubbornness than skill. The math was simple, the choice was not. Rebecca, he said quietly, never taking his eyes off the approaching riders, is there another way out of town? The old mining trail, behind the church. But Jack, but nothing. He stepped in front of her, placing his body between the woman and the crowd that had already decided her fate. Sometimes a man has to choose which side of a line he wants to die on. The federal marshals reined in 20 feet away, their leader's cold eyes sweeping the crowd before settling on Rebecca's pale face. Miss Dalton, the marshal said, you're under arrest for conspiracy in the murder of federal investigators. 5 minutes, the lead marshal said, consulting a pocket watch with the casual authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed, to say your goodbyes and gather your things. The crowd had pulled back like a receding tide, leaving Jack and Rebecca isolated in a circle of dust and judgment. Sheriff Coleman made no move to intervene. Federal warrants trumped local authority, and everyone knew it. Jack felt Rebecca's hand brush against his arm, light as a whisper. Thank you, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her fingers. But you don't need to make this your fight. He turned to study her face, really look at her for the first time without the town's fears clouding his vision. She was younger than he'd thought, maybe 25, with eyes that held too much sorrow for someone who should have been planning a future instead of running from a past. My father, she said quietly, aware the marshals were watching but not yet close enough to hear. He wasn't what they think. He tried to expose corruption in the railroad contracts. That's why they killed him. The bonds, the murders, it was all staged to make him look guilty. Jack nodded slowly. He'd seen enough corruption in his years riding through territories where law came from whoever had the most guns and the deepest pockets. You have proof. She reached into her shawl and withdrew a small leather journal, worn smooth from handling. His records, names, dates, payments, everything. I've been carrying it for 5 years waiting for someone who might listen. The gesture was simple, but it spoke volumes. This woman who'd been called cursed, who'd watched 3 husbands die, trusting him with the one thing that might clear her father's name, or get them both killed trying. Rebecca, Her real name felt strange on his tongue, but right somehow. If we run, they'll hunt us from here to Mexico. I know. She glanced toward the church where the old mining trail began. But I'm tired of running alone. The marshal called out, "Time's up, Miss Dalton." Jack made his choice then, not with his gun hand but with something deeper. He reached up and untied the leather cord from around his neck, pulling free a small silver locket, the only thing he had left of his dead sister, carried through 10 years of wandering. "So you'll have something to remember me by," he said, pressing it into her palm. "When this is over." Her fingers closed around the locket, and for the first time since he'd known her, Rebecca Dalton smiled. The marshals started forward, hands moving toward their weapons. Asterisk. Jack's voice cut through the tension like a rifle shot. "Marshal, before you take her, might want to know who's been paying your expenses." The lead marshal's hand froze halfway to his gun. "What did you say?" "The journal, Rebecca." Jack kept his eyes locked on the federal man. Page 43. With trembling fingers, she opened the worn leather book and began to read aloud. "Payment to Federal Marshal Clayton Morse, $5,000. Payment to Deputy Marshal William Hayes, $3,000, both for services rendered in the elimination of Marcus Dalton investigation." The crowd stirred uneasily. Sheriff Coleman stepped closer, his own suspicions finally crystallizing into certainty. Marshal Morse's face had gone the color of old bone. "Those are forgeries," Morse said, but his voice carried the hollow ring of desperation. "Maybe," Jack said, "but that tin star on your chest, it's got a distinctive scratch across the eagle's wing." Same scratch mentioned in her father's notes from their last meeting, the meeting where he told you he had evidence of railroad corruption, day before he died. The silence stretched like a held breath. Then Sheriff Coleman's gun cleared leather with practiced speed. "Federal warrant or not," Coleman said, "I've got jurisdiction over murder in my county." What followed was swift and final. Morse reached for his gun and found Jack's Colt already waiting. The sound echoed off the storefronts like thunder, sending birds scattering from the church steeple. When the smoke cleared, Marshal Morse lay still in the dust. His remaining men, faced with a sheriff's badge and evidence of their commander's corruption, chose survival over loyalty. The journal would eventually make its way to territorial authorities, who still remembered what justice meant. Marcus Dalton's name would be cleared, his daughter's nightmare ended. The railroad men who'd orchestrated his murder would face their own reckonings, but that was months in the future. For now, Jack helped Rebecca to her feet, the silver locket still clutched in her palm. The townspeople watched in subdued silence as she walked to the church steps and sat down heavily, finally free to rest after 5 years of running. "What happens now?" she asked. Jack settled beside her, hat tilted against the lowering sun. "Now we see if a curse can turn into a blessing." Years later, visitors to Salvation Creek would hear about the woman who brought death to 3 husbands but saved a town from its own fear. They'd see her tending flowers behind the church, often accompanied by a weathered man in a worn hat who'd learned that some things were worth standing for. The last light of day painted the mountains gold, and all was quiet on Main Street.